So the last few years have been all about the 70s and integrated bracelets, obviously aping Genta's design. But the last year has definitely shown us that the 80s are coming back. Hi everyone and welcome to Hublot. And yes, today we are going to be talking about some of the best watches from the 80s as well as their influence on the current watch market, including which watches have been resurrected and where I think we're going to see a little bit more 80s influence in the future. Now, for a little bit of background, if you look at watch design over the last few years, obviously with the AP Royal Oak and Patek Philippe Nautilus doing so well, every watchmaker and their mother wants to make an integrated bracelet. We saw so much of it over the last few years, but in 2020 it sort of slowed down. Instead, there was a different trend that we saw from watch companies, and that was bringing out watches that were designed in the 80s or definitely have a lot of 80s undertones. And that, for me, I think it just shows the natural progression. You know, everything is cyclical and it might just be the 80s' turn to come back. So to start things off, let's talk about some watches that were released in 2020 that were definitely heavily 80s influenced. And I'm going to do this in the order of when their originals were released. So that starts with 1980, the turn of the decade itself, and Hublot. In 1980, MDM Geneve, then owned by Carlo Crocco, released its MDM Geneve Hublot. A very simple, clean dial, thin watch. In that case, it was quartz. And most importantly, it was a pioneer in the fact that it was the first watch to combine rubber with a precious metal. In that case, was yellow gold. Last year, Hublot celebrating its 40th anniversary, they saw fit to celebrate this model with their Hublot Classic Fusion XL. XL being the Roman numeral for 40 and happens to coincide with the sizing choices of Hublot for the last few years. On paper, this is the same Hublot Classic Fusion that we know and love. 45 millimeters in this case, Sellita SW300 on the inside, rubber strap of course, but a few big changes. First off, the reintroduction of yellow gold, something that has been missing from the Hublot collection for the last few years, unless you count their magic gold, but that's kind of like more of a yellow than a gold really. And also they simplified the dial, made it a lot cleaner. Now some people would say, take away the indices, it's a lot harder to read, it's more like a fashion watch, but you can tell they are clearly reaching back to their original history and commemorating that. And I hope that this starts a new generation of classic fusions that still keep that integral 80s look, but hopefully it's a sign of things to come that they're going to revamp the classic fusion itself. My personal theory is that because that was the special edition, they saw fit to use the Sellita movement because they could get better margin on that, sell a special edition with a third-party movement, even more money for you to make. But I'd really like to see them now reintroduce a properly 80s inspired Hublot classic fusion that's got that elegant sportiness, but with either an in-house movement or something from the LVMH group, like perhaps the Zenith Elite. I think that'll be a great move for Hublot and something we can hopefully see in the future. But I really hope this 80s inspired aesthetic perseveres because it just looks cool. And really, I don't think anyone has ever been able to properly capture that magic in the same way that Hublot has. For all the shit people give it for ripping off AP, I think they started off their own trend that everyone else has tried to rip off, and honestly, I don't think anyone does it as good as Hublot does when it comes to a precious metal, nice industrial looking case on a rubber strap. Next, moving on to 1982, we have the Omega Constellation Manhattan, or the Griffin Claw. Now, the Omega Constellation had already been around for decades before that, but really came to prominence with the Manhattan Griffin Claw. Released in 1982, it introduced those two little claws that are on the bezel. Originally, those were functional, those were to actually keep the sapphire clamp down, but now they're just an interesting design. Last year, Omega brought those back and really updated it for the 21st century, including a ceramic bezel insert, putting in the Meta certified master chronometer movements on the inside. But it's clearly a play at that 80s design. They've really brought it into the 21st century, and I hope that this breathes new life into the Constellation range. Historically, the Constellations have sold very well in Asia, but they don't really get much love outside of Asia. So it'll be great to see it have a bit more mass appeal. And I think if the 80s are what's going to be sort of the next trend, then definitely Omega is ahead of the curve with it, and I'd like to see what they do in the future with this design as well. Next up, from 1984, we have the Breitling Chronomat. Much like the previously mentioned Omega, the Chronomat had existed for a while, but at that time it hadn't really caught on, and this was also just after the quartz crisis, so Breitling really needed something to save it. So what they did is they came out with the redesigned Chronomat, and this was a huge milestone for Breitling. For one, it introduced an iconic look that has shaped most of their modern collection in one way or another over the last 30 odd years. Secondly, this was the first example of Breitling using the 7750 inside it. This was a movement that would carry the brand for decades to come. Only somewhat recently, i.e. since 2009, have they started putting in their own in-house movement, and that was even released on a Chronomat as well, albeit the more modern one. However, since 1984, the design of the Chronomat has gotten bigger, chunkier, and shinier. Some of that is still kind of 80s. I mean, the 80s was all about ostentatiousness and showiness, but it lost a lot of that 80s charm and the beauty that came with the original Chronomat. But all that changed last year when Georges Kern announced the brand new Breitling Chronomat 42 with the B01 on the inside. It had that iconic Hublot bracelet, which is totally different from anything else on the market. They really took that 1984 design, modernized it, but kept the spirit of it. They just changed a few proportions, improved the build quality, and of course changed the movement. And I think this is a phenomenal example. The only thing I'd like to see from this collection to make it even better is the introduction of a steel and yellow gold two-tone, just to really round out the 80s-ness of it. But I really hope this is a huge success for Breitling, and I think it is, because it's made the Chronomat much more appealing, much more accessible from a sizing perspective, and also much more elegant. It's not as blingy and showy as some of its 2000s predecessors. And then the last of the 2020 inspired releases was the reintroduction of the originally produced in 1985 Cartier Pasha. Now, I actually own the evolution of that 1985 Pasha. That was a continuous run from 1985 up until the early 2010s when it was discontinued. Then it had the Calibre de Cartier and then the Calibre de Cartier Diver, filling that sort of gap of the quasi-sporty aquatic Cartier. And then they brought it back last year as they discontinued the Calibre de Cartier. Obviously, they've increased the size and a few of the proportions. And what they did is, again, they did what Cartier does best. Cartier is always riding its own coattails, but it keeps introducing icons. They have so many iconic watches and designs, you can't blame them for riding their own coattails. And this 1980s design was really amazing for a couple of reasons. First off, it was a Genta design that didn't feature an integrated bracelet, but it still featured an interesting bracelet. The hinge lugs were different from what you saw back then, as well as what you see now. And they're extremely comfortable, and it makes the watch a lot more appropriate for different sized wrists because they pivot right down. Of course, with the new version, they've included Cartier's quick switch system, as well as improving the movement on the inside. But I think what they've done is they've created a foundation for an amazing looking collection that hopefully will evolve in the same way that the original run did. The original run produced perpetual calendars, retrogrades, chronographs, GMTs. They even had the grill version, which actually imitated those old diving helmets. There's so much they can do with this collection. I'd love to see where they take it, and hopefully they can recapture some of the glory of the original 80s model as well. So that was 2020, but now we're in 2021. What can we expect from the future that was produced in the past? What can we expect in terms of 80s design watches? And the other icon that has its roots in the 80s is the IWC da Vinci. Now, da Vinci was actually released prior to the 80s, but it was a completely different shape. The 1985 IWC da Vinci perpetual calendar was a complete shift in what they had been selling, and ironically it was very similar to the 1985 Pasha in that they both had these hinged lugs. Now the mechanism itself is a little bit different, but they still have the same effect, and it makes it very easy to wear. However, IWC in 2017 ditched the actual sort of hinge system and now has a more conventional strap system. Two things they can do: they can either bring that back, or more importantly, what I think they can do is they can explore ceramics, because in the 80s, the IWC da Vinci was the first watch to use a fully ceramic case. I think reintroducing that, maybe even making the IWC da Vinci a little bit sportier, I think it could be a great way for IWC to differentiate the da Vinci from the Portuguese, because they both seem like sort of dress watches, and more importantly, a way to bring a bit more appeal, because the Portuguese has its own following. It's extremely iconic for the brand. The da Vinci has, to a degree, always played second fiddle. So I think that by introducing new materials, a new positioning for it, and even putting on a rubber strap to it, making it precious metal with rubber and a bit of ceramic in there, I think they could offer a great alternative to something like an Hublot Classic Fusion, but with a lot more horological clout perhaps, and something that's going to be completely different in terms of aesthetics, in terms of the actual case shape. But that's just a quick glimpse into the influence of the 80s on the current watch design, as well as what I think it's going to influence in the future. But I'd love to know your impressions of what you think of these watches. In your view, what are the most iconic watches of the 80s, and what 80s watches do you want to see make a comeback or maybe update their current versions so they can hark back to that 80s design? I really like to know what you guys think in the comments below. And of course, if you like this video, make sure you like it and share it. If you want to see more pictures of watches and infographics, make sure you follow me on Instagram at Shaluso. And of course, if you want to see more videos of watches, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell as well so you know when my next video comes out. In any case, thanks for watching this video, and we'll catch you on the next one.